Very excited to have this afternoon's programming on the 2016 election. It will be particularly interesting, as I'm sure all of you have been following the election this year. Very excited to have insight from two panels. So to get started, I'm going to throw things over to Tom Bevan of Real Clear Politics. Tom?
Thank you. Well, first I just want to say thank you to the Manhattan Institute, the Adam Smith Society for having us here. As a point of personal privilege, I am thrilled to be here. It's a great honor to be sharing the stage with these two gentlemen, distinguished intellectuals, and I can't wait to hear what they have to say, as much as you guys do. So we're going to do about 25 minutes of discussion, then we'll finish with about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A. You guys all know the deal with the microphones on either side. My strategy as a moderator is to stay the hell out of the way and let these guys talk. So I'm going to be short on introductions. These guys really don't need any introductions, and we'll just get right to it. To my right is Bill Kristol. He's the founder and editor of the Weekly Standard. To his right is Bill Galston, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Wall Street Journal columnist. So, as everyone here knows, the voters in South Carolina are rendering their verdict on the Republican nomination as we speak. Bill, if Donald Trump wins today, as the polls suggest that he could very well do, he will have won two of the first three contests in the Republican nomination. Will he be able to be stopped if he wins tonight? And if so, how will he be stopped?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's begin with a cheerful topic here. Total collapse of the Republican Party, the conservative movement, the American experiment in self-government. But it's okay, it's got to be good humored. You guys have a great future ahead of you there. Just working in Trump Enterprises or something like that. Well, I will say it's good to be here. I'm a big fan of the Adam Smith Society. I remember talking with Marilyn Fedak when she was thinking of doing this, and I think it's been a great success and a much-needed institution, organization, and I hope you all, I'm sure you all have benefited from it and enjoyed it, I trust, and will do even more on your campuses. If he wins, I think there's a chance he won't win tonight, a little more of a chance than most people think. He has been fading a little. He doesn't seem to. I do think he gets his voters early, and as voters come close to voting, this is very much true in Iowa, they might shy away from really casting that ballot for Trump, so he keeps his hardcore vote, but doesn't get sort of the last-minute undecided and leaners. Now, in New Hampshire, he did, so we have data going one way in Iowa and another way in New Hampshire. We'll see here in South Carolina. I think if it's close, it's presumably with Rubio and Cruz, or Cruz and Rubio within a few points of him and within a couple of points of each other. Then I think we have a real three-way race going forward. It's better to be the guy who has been second, first, and first than the person who's been, what would Cruz have been, first, third, and second or third, and Rubio would be whatever. But, it's not over. 3 states will have voted, 47, 48 more still have to, plus Guam and a couple of those places that get delegates. And I do think at the end, I still guess I have sort of enough of an old-fashioned view that Trump is not qualified to be president and keeps saying things that should disqualify him even further from being president, that maybe the voters at some point will decide that they agree with that judgment, but they're not. And final point, it does make a big difference how many votes he got. If he got, what did he get, 24% in Iowa, 35% in New Hampshire, I guess?
Yep.
If he comes down to, 30, 28, 27, he will be strong. He'll be stronger than anyone else. He will have a chance to win the nomination, maybe a better chance almost than Rubio or Cruz or some long shot who might, I guess, probably at that point becomes a three-way race. But it's not like getting 24, 35, and let's say 29 is overwhelming. We're not talking about getting 55% of the vote in huge state primaries. So I think there's still a long way to go. There will be a consolidation against Trump behind, I would imagine, both Cruz. Cruz probably has most of his consolidation already, but especially Rubio. And I think we'll have a very interesting race, very unusual race. I don't know, Bill, when the last time we've had two-way races that have gone on forever, Reagan, Ford, and Obama, Clinton. We haven't really had, we've had front runners against lots of annoying candidates type races. That's the usual Republican model, I don't know if we've had a genuine race where three candidates had, somewhat of a almost equal chance to win, maybe going through a whole bunch of states. It'll be quite interesting to watch.
So, Bill, that leads me to you. If we do get down to a three-person race quickly, perhaps even as soon as this week, depending on how things shake out today, Are we headed toward a contested convention?
Well, it depends on, number one, how long the race remains a three-person race, and number two, exactly how the votes are divided. Because there are, for you business school students, my son was one of you just a couple of years ago.
And don't worry about the fact that he's unemployed. It's really, he's just taking a few years off. Our daughter was one of you. Was one of you too. They're both doing fine. So.
My son, the venture capitalist, only wishes he were taking a lot of time off right now. Although with the valuation sinking so quickly in that world, who knows? Because there are non-linearities built into the rules. It makes a difference whether you get just above a line that's defined by the rules or fall just below it for the allocation of delegates. Some of those thresholds are quite high. And so if you genuinely have 3 candidates, each of whom clears the threshold, then a recent analysis indicates that, given current assumptions, Trump will end up with only about 80 or 81% of the delegates he would need to go over the top. And then we would have something that is every political leader's nightmare and every political scientist's dream, namely a convention which you enter without knowing what the
And let me just add,
exit's
as the proprietor of a political website.
Yeah.
Yeah, we want that.
Yeah. No, outstanding. I would also say this, Tom. Trump has a surprisingly high floor and a surprisingly low ceiling. Because within his own party, there are a large and I would say growing number of people who are saying, in effect, that I wouldn't vote for that man if he were the only Republican contestant. And that, I think, is going to create a very different, interesting dynamic, and it's not a dynamic that's necessarily going to end when the Republican nominating process ends. I've heard my colleague to my, well, I guess it's stage right to your left, say that he cannot support Donald Trump. He said that in my institution, the Brookings Institution, just a few days ago, and he openly predicted that if Trump is the nominee, that there may well be an independent, real conservative candidate in the race. I don't know whether you've had a chance to review and revise that opinion, but it's a very interesting one.
Well, I have that opinion. I haven't quite found the perfect candidate yet, but if any of you is 35 years old, I'm open to that. I was talking with
America, or Trump will sue you.
I mean, Bill is right that, yeah, exactly. Bill is right that every political scientist and also political commentator, or website proprietor, magazine editor, commenter on TV and radio wants, of course, a brokered or an uncertain convention. It would be so exciting. I was talking with my friend Spence Abraham, who was the senator from Michigan and is a real political expert who's been through even more of these than I have. But he reminded me of, think what that would really be like in practice. I mean, a Republican convention. I mean, the people who show up at these conventions are not, I mean, the establishment thinks it's, going to be a bunch of people like them, the big donors and major figures, responsible stakeholders in the party. But of course, that's not who tends to become the delegates at this convention. For a lot of them, it's going to be great. Free hotel room in Cleveland, free food everywhere, nice receptions. They'll be in no rush to end it, truthfully, and they'd be in a rush to end it if they had to pay for the hotel room, but I assume the campaigns will offer to pay for their room for weeks on end. So we'll be going in to through the weekend in Cleveland. The media will be having a great time covering all these lunatics wearing elephant hats, and and of course the Trump delegates, God knows what they'll be saying. Endless grist. It really could be the destruction of the Republican Party, basically. It could be. I've been taking the line that it's going to be great, it's going to be fine, with a little democracy in action, and they'll come out of it stronger. But when Spence actually had me do this, pictured in my mind, so what it's actually going to be like on national television for days on end, with the bargaining and the fighting. It maybe be better if it got resolved before the convention.
You don't say.
All right, Bill Galston, let me ask you, for as much attention that has been showered on the GOP's demolition derby, Democrats also voting today, caucusing in Nevada. Hillary Clinton took a drubbing in New Hampshire. She was a few coin flips away from losing Iowa. To Bernie Sanders, she could potentially lose today. If she does lose to Sanders in Nevada today, what does that mean? What comes next for the Democrats?
South Carolina. And I mean that seriously, because
But how much trouble is she in, really?
we won't know until South Carolina, and here's why. She and her husband and her friends have spent decades establishing intense relationships with the African American community, which will make up roughly 55% of the Democratic electorate in South Carolina. Her entire theory of the case is that she can lose the white vote to Bernie Sanders, as she has been doing and probably will do in Nevada, but she will be dominant in the African American portion of the party. Up until this morning, and nothing has changed since this morning, I trust, that bet appears to be a sound one. Her numbers have come down a little bit among African Americans, but she still has more than 60% support in that community. Sanders has less than 30% support in that community, and those numbers don't appear to be moving very quickly at this point. So if that holds, she will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. Will it be a strong, glorious victory? No, but a win is a win.
So
Let me just add one general point, because
Yeah.
I mean, we got so quickly into the primaries, which is fine, but it is worth just noting what an amazing year it is. I mean, I looked at the Real Clear Politics average of the polls a year ago exactly, yes. You should all go to Real Clear Politics, read all the links to find articles, the polls, it's very useful, and the polls are particularly useful, obviously, to have all of them in one place. So exactly a year ago, February 20th, Rubio and Cruz were each at 5%, I think 6th and 7th in the Republican race, behind Bush, Walker, Rand Paul, Huckabee, one or two others who had run before, or better known. And Trump wasn't being polled because everyone assumed he was just goofing around and wouldn't run this time. On the Democratic side, Hillary was around 60%. Sanders was actually behind the other people who were going to run or were thinking of running, including O'Malley, and he was 1%, literally. I don't think we've ever had a situation where we've had in both parties, at least in modern times, in the same year, such a bizarre race. I mean, it's not even good or bad, just analytically such a surprising. No one a year ago in his right mind would have said three-way Trump, Cruz, Rubio, with Trump probably a little bit ahead on the Republican side, and Hillary and Bernie dead even. I mean, Sanders ahead right now in delegates and votes, or I guess in votes, of Hillary Clinton. Think of it that way. Here's the way to think of it. Who would have said a year ago that Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders would have won the most votes in each party? I mean, it really is jaw-dropping. Now, it could just be, weird things happen. There are a lot of contingencies. Things are path-dependent and, whatever. And you end up, Pat Buchanan got a lot of votes on the Republican side at one point, didn't become the nominee. Other people parties have had flare-ups which have subsided, so to speak, and maybe that's what it is. And you look around the country in general, it doesn't look like a country that's in the middle of a total political revolution. There are a lot of regular governors in a lot of states. The senators are a pretty normal bunch of senators. There aren't riots in the streets. So I'm open to the view that it's just a bunch of weird things happened. Trump's a very talented demagogue. Clinton is a particularly weak Democratic heir to Obama for various reasons, and Sanders caught a wave of unhappiness about sort of the economy and about the failures of liberals to really take on the banks and Wall Street and all that. Or it really could be a moment, where what we're seeing reflects much deeper things, or some combination of the two, presumably. But it is worth just thinking about as we go through the rest of this year, in addition to following every week's primaries and caucuses, which are very interesting and important to follow, to try to get more of a sense of what are we really seeing here and how significant and what does it tell us about the country.
Well, it's interesting because that's my next question.
Okay.
But
Bill.
Before I get there, I want to go back, Bill, to this idea, Bill Galston, that the Clinton campaign, they could lose the white vote. That's what we heard, right? Iowa's very white. New Hampshire's very white. The vote in Nevada is going to be 50% non-white. Hispanics were a cornerstone of her coalition that kept her in the race against Obama 8 years ago. So doesn't that sort of put the lie to this idea that, it's just the it's just the white vote? I mean, if she loses Hispanics to him, could African Americans be next?
They could. I don't think they will be. But I would be quite surprised, and we can check this very quickly. I would be quite surprised to discover that half the caucus goers in Nevada today, half the Democratic caucus goers, are non-white. That, I think, has not been the history of the Nevada caucus, but that may be correct, or it may be correct this time around if Sanders has done a particularly good job of mobilizing them. One of the problems, by the way, for lower wage workers participating in caucuses is they take a long time. A lot of those people would have to take a half a day or a full day off from work. I've heard interviews with them saying they'd love to, but they simply can't afford to. So there's some technical complications, but these are details. Getting to the deeper question, I don't think this is just a momentary flare-up. And I have a standard short lecture on the subject that I will spare you, although I should say I'm a former college professor, so if you'd like the 50-minute version, I can give it to you impromptu as soon as this session is over. I think that the story, which goes back decades of the American economy, lies at the heart of what we're seeing right now. I do not subscribe to the view that everything that people are unhappy about started 6 years ago. This is not a simply, in my judgment, partisan story. It's a much longer story about the changing role of the U.S. economy in the world, the impact of a dramatic expansion of global markets, the impact of technological change on the number, for example, of production workers that it takes to produce a ton of steel or an automobile. The gains in efficiency have been astounding. The shrinkage in the manufacturing sector reminds me a lot of the long cycle shrinkage of the agricultural sector, where output increased dramatically and the share of the population and eventually the absolute numbers of people in the population engaged in agricultural endeavors declined for a full century. I don't see why manufacturing, under the impact of technological revolution, should be any different. And when you combine technology and globalization, you have long cycle trends that have been buffeting the U.S. economy now with increasing force for 40 years. And we haven't really figured out how to deal with it over the long term in a way that replaces the middle income jobs that are being lost as a result of these trends with an equivalent number of middle income jobs. And so you have lots of people who are doing as well as everybody in this room is going to do, and you have lots of people who are doing less well than their fathers did, and you don't have as many people in the middle, that vast middle that sustain not only the domestic market, but also, to be Aristotelian about it, the stability of a Republican system of government. So I am worried that if these trends are not checked, and if the middle class does not begin expanding after 4 decades of decline as a share of the population, these are facts, not opinions, then I think we're going to be in deeper and deeper trouble.
And if you wanted to add to that, I think the cultural breakup of the family side of things with the Charles Murray from the right and Bob Putnam from the left have both analyzed in recent books, and they don't really disagree that much on the data. They have slight disagreements on causality and what to do about it. And you throw that into the mix too, you do end up with you could end up with a worrying kind of sociological and cultural and economic prospect for the country, of which you could then say this election is kind of a symptom or a reflection or whatever the right word is. I mean, you could also be
leading indicator.
Leading indicator. I mean, what's funny, and it's funny because I would have said a few years ago that the country was amazingly stable. I would have expected after the shock of 07, 08, after the difficulties of the war in Iraq, after the turmoil of that first part of this century and millennium, more kind of upright. I mean, historically, this is where you should get populist uprisings from the right and the left. So you got very little. I mean, you got a tame one really with Barack Obama defeating Hillary Clinton. You got a pretty tame one with the Tea Party. I actually used to say in speeches, it's sort of a tribute to the resilience of the American political system that it absorbed all of this. Obama beat Clinton within the Democratic primary. Tea Party candidates ran in primaries in Florida and Texas, and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz and others knocked off some establishment candidates, and the Republican Party sort of absorbed that kind of populist uprising. But in this case, in a way, that may have been just a temporary absorption, you might say. And I do think you could argue that with Sanders and with Trump, you're getting a slightly different version, maybe a less healthy, if I can put it that way, version of the same thing. On the other hand, just to make the obvious point, I mean, if you end up with Hillary Clinton as the Democratic nominee, that is a very, the party in power after 8 years usually nominates the sitting vice president. That he chose not to run this time. So if they don't nominate a sitting vice president, they nominate a senior statesman type, usually a McCain, for example, in 2008. And so that's certainly Hillary Clinton. She's the de facto, almost, you might say, vice presidential successor. The party out of power usually often nominates, in an open seat election like this, a younger candidate, as if implicitly kind of reacting against the, we're the out of power with time for a change party. So that was everything from John Kennedy in 1960 to Obama in 2008. And of course, Rubio and Cruz would fit that perfectly. So if we end up with Hillary Clinton against either Rubio or Cruz, you'll end up with, in a way, the most normal, election in a case where one party has held office for 8 years, and a pretty close election, it looks like, from the polls, which also is kind of normal. So it's sort of a weird year where it could be the most bizarre general election we've had in decades, or a very normal-looking one.
Yeah, but the difference is that as a result of the primary contest, those candidates, especially in the case of Hillary Clinton, will not be running on the platforms that they. In other words, the two parties have been forced even farther apart through the dynamic of this process. And if more traditional candidates are selected at the end of the line, they will be saying less traditional things in defense of their candidacy in the general election.
And there might be more unhappiness about each of them
Exactly.
from the supporters of the person who wouldn't have won, the Trump or Sanders.
As hard as this is to believe, I'm actually getting the sign that we're almost out of time.
Oh, no.
And I feel like we're just getting going, so that's a bummer. But before we go to questions, I want to ask you guys a question that's sort of more particular to this audience. I have to skip over a bunch of other questions that I had. Part of what it seems to me what's going on in the country is that there is a failure of public trust in all the institutions that we used to trust: government, Wall Street, the financial system, even the Supreme Court is at a low point in terms of its standing. And I want to ask you about, is there a crisis of trust in free market capitalism? There was a YouGov poll that came out, many of you might have seen it, that more than a third of millennials, 18 to 29-year-olds, 36% of them hold a favorable view of socialism versus 39% who hold the same view of capitalism favorably. Shame on you guys. Furthermore, even among Democrats, 43% viewed socialism favorably, 43% viewed capitalism favorably. And I'm just wondering, we're seeing this economic populism represented on the right by Trump and on the left by Sanders, and in many ways it's an indictment of our system. What do you think? Is there a crisis of free market capitalism in the country or not?
There is an unusual level of discontent. Whether it's a crisis remains to be seen, but it is not, to quote one of our founders, a light and transient phenomenon. And as proof, I would point to populist uprisings on the left and the right throughout the advanced industrial democracies. Pervasive, there are Trump figures and Sanders figures breaking out all across Europe. The Labor Party, having gone through 2 decades of new labor, is now firmly back in the hands of old labor, amazingly old labor. Someone who genuinely believes in collective ownership of the means of production and getting Britain out of the nuclear business, et cetera, et cetera. You find Donald Trump-like figures in France, in Hungary, now in Poland, in Italy. The list goes on and on. So let me just summarize this thought by saying that trust is the fruit of performance. And when institutions or systems cease performing as they promised and as they were expected to, a withdrawal of trust is the inevitable consequence. The last point I'd make is that this is not a new problem, the withdrawal of trust. In the mid-1960s, trust in the federal government stood at 75% among the American people. 10 years later, trust stood at 28%. And it has not recovered since the mid-1970s. There have been ups during Reagan and Clinton and downs. But we went from a high-trust society in the 1950s and 60s to a low-trust society starting in the 1970s. And frankly, we've been there ever since.
Any final thoughts?
No, I think I think it's true, and I think one interesting question is, I tend to say when speaking to elite audiences, if I can put it that way, which is most of the audiences one speaks to, if you're kind of in our business, they tend to blame the public for losing trust in them. And I do like to say, and Bill implied this, to whether it's a business elites or economic elites or political elites or media elites, maybe the public is not foolish necessarily to have lost trust in elites. Now losing trust in elites can be healthy. It can lead to some turnover within elites, new people coming up, healthy kind of political change and reform, or it can lead to people grasping onto, even when the trust is well earned, it can lead to people, the distrust is well earned, it can lead to people grasping onto foolish things that are even worse than these somewhat flawed elites that they might be looking at. I do think that, just from a Republican point of view and a conservative point of view, and I imagine many of you in this room are inclined in that direction, I think the Republican Party, to some degree the conservative movement, but more the party really, just never came to grips with 07, 08. I mean, it was so, we can say it was Barney Frank, it was this, it was liberal policies that caused a lot of the problems. We didn't need to have them bail out if only, there are many learned studies, it was the Fed, and if things could have worked out much more quickly as they did in 1921 and all this, there's a lot of arguments. At the end of the day, the American public, having had Republican president for 7 years at that point, having had a Republican Congress until November '06, so really for the bulk of that time, for the last decade, looked up and having had Republican appointees running the Fed and people whom conservatives told them to respect a lot, Greenspan, Bernanke, and all this, maybe not conservatives, but let's say business leaders told them to respect. Suddenly the whole of Hank Paulson, from Goldman as Secretary of the Treasury, it's all the best and the brightest, and the whole system, and everyone's, don't worry about it, we got everything under control, we can never have another collapse like we had in 29 or 32 or 3, we've dispersed risk brilliantly among all these fantastic new instruments of debt and so forth, and suddenly the whole world economy is on the verge of total and utter collapse, and people's houses went down 30% in 6 months, and their cousin lost a job, and suddenly, and their IRAs, if they had them, were down again 30%. And I think the degree of shock, and the truth is, of course, elites recovered okay from that. Mm-hmm. And New York's doing fine, and DC's doing fine, and most people in this room will do fine, I think, and we're doing fine. And the market's back up to where it was and so forth. But I think, the working class and middle class, is the point Bill's been making a long time, didn't recover. They gradually got a little better, but still not what they had expected, not like from previous shocks where they really felt 5 years afterwards, okay, we got through that. No, it's still more like we're struggling to get back to where we were. And secondly, the political system didn't respond much at all. In that respect, Mitt Romney, good guy and all this, and I think would have been better for the country than Obama, didn't certainly speak to that fear at all. On the Democratic side, it's a little more complicated, but I don't know that President Obama, he may have felt he may have done the right thing, honestly, by keeping people like Tim Geithner or whatever in place because it reassured the markets. But if you're just a person looking at this, really, we elected Barack Obama, we got the exact same people running Treasury and the Fed, and what Sanders says isn't crazy. Some what he says is crazy, but what he says about how come Wall Street didn't pay a price for this, isn't entirely crazy from the public's point of view. So I do think I kind of agree with Bill. I think just to be a little more precise version of what Bill was saying, I do think the economic crisis shock is something that politically, at least, whatever the intellectual arguments that people can make that may have explained it, politically, the Republican Party didn't kind of absorb and come back with an explanation of why the policies going forward aren't the same ones that got us into trouble. That's what Clinton did to clobbered Romney in 2012. He just said, look, you just want to go back to Bush's economic policies. Where did that end us up? At least Obama's got us in some kind of recovery. And Romney didn't have a very good answer to that, honestly, or at least not a politically effective answer. He probably could have given you an intelligent answer if he had half an hour. And I'm a little worried this time, too, that at the end of the day, saying, well, lower taxes and deregulation, isn't that what Republicans were running on for the 20 years before 2008? So what's the difference,
All right, we've got to open it up for questions. We've got a few minutes. Again, make your way to the microphones on either side. Yes, sir.
Hey, good afternoon. Chad Rawlings from Wharton. Thanks for coming and speaking with us today. I've heard that Michael Bloomberg has a couple scenarios where he would consider running. How do you see that playing out, and do you see it siphoning off more Republican or Democratic votes if he does decide to enter the race?
Let's let Bill Galston handle this.
Well, there's a very interesting question which Bill Kristol himself surfaced at Brookings just a few days ago as to whether we're going to have 2, 3, or 4 major candidates in the race. Bloomberg, I think, will not get in at all unless the Republicans nominate Trump and the Democrats nominate Sanders. Put it the other way around, I think he's almost certain to enter if that happens. On the other hand, if Bill is representative of the honorable remnant of the conservative movement, there may very well be a breakaway from the Trump populist nomination, what I've deemed in one of my columns as a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. And at that point, there could be 4 significant candidates in the race. Now, if there are only 3 in the race, I say with some confidence that Bloomberg would take more votes away from the Democrats than he would from the Republicans. If there are 4 candidates in the race, I think all bets are off, right? That's the many-body problem that physicists haven't been able to solve, and I don't think political analysts are going to do any better, frankly.
All right, let's go over here. You, sir.
Hi, Justin Schaefer, JD MBA at Wake Forest. I had a question. So it's January, February, we're talking about Trump. What do you think if in October, say, the Ken Langones of the world, the heavy Republican donors started an anti-Trump super PAC? Do you think that would have been effective?
I think there is actually a little bit of an anti-Trump super PAC, which is actually doing a decent job, but it was a little late. I mean, look, people understandably wanted to support who they wanted to support, and they believed, and I had this belief too, that Trump would just fall of his own weight, so why put up a ton of money against him? And then the interest, and this is really what crippled people, this is also a version of, it's not the multi-body problem, but it's a kind of classic public choice problem. Everyone had his own interest then in the race. So the Rubio, I mean, I know this, I've talked to them all, I mean, the Rubio people and the Cruz people were too busy jockeying to take each other down, or in the case of Bush was certainly trying to get rid of Rubio, and Rubio had to fight back against Bush, and Bush and Kasich had to fight each other for 4th place, and they were all fighting each other, and no one was fighting Trump. I mean, that's not quite literally true, but it's almost true. And until about a month ago, it's literally true. So we think, I think if you edit the Weekly Standard, if you're Brookings writing for the Journal, and if you're Real Clear Politics, you think, well, there's been a lot of exposing of Trump. People have written 1 million articles, a lot of stuff online and all this. But in actual paid advertising, almost nothing.
Exactly.
We do not know, we still don't know, in my opinion, how well his support, he has some hard base of support, but how would even that hard base hold up against a really sustained, intelligent, skillful, classic, modern, professional advertising campaign against him? Look what they did to Romney.
Exactly.
Who was a very decent and honorable businessman. And wouldn't that do something to Trump? I'm not so convinced as everyone else. That Trump, so I think, and that's an interesting question going forward, because I do think finally after today, we get a real winning out of the race. An awful lot of donors are liberated to say, okay, I can help either personally, Rubio or Cruz, but basically I could also really help try to take down Trump, and the whole Bush complication goes away. I mean, an awful lot, $100 million is a lot of money that a lot of people gave to Bush. They could have given more money, a lot of these people, honestly, to an anti-Trump effort, but I personally talked to a lot of them. It was like, geez, maybe I'd like, let me let them finish wasting the Bush money first before I give my next, tranche of money. Now I think it looks urgent, especially if Trump wins in South Carolina today. So I think it will be an interesting test, and I do not know the answer, obviously, is when you really have lots of ads up exposing different aspects of Trump's career, personal life, positions on different issues, business history, incidentally. How does his vote stand up as we move forward? But it's getting late. I mean, those ads have to go up pretty fast to make a difference on March 1st or March 15th.
Bill, did you want to add something quick?
Just one sentence on that. There's an additional reason that Bill was too polite to mention as to why this hasn't happened. Namely, a lot of the candidates who were in the race with him wanted to pick up his followers after he collapsed. And so they were reluctant to antagonize them.
All right, over here, sir.
I'm Frank Sampino from Southern Methodist. I was wondering, you guys had a discussion about Trump's coalition that he's assembled, and I, on the one hand, totally agree. It seems to be a working class phenomenon that has played out in the past with Pat Buchanan and other candidates, and that would be an indictment of business conservatives like us, kind of, for not reaching out and including working class concerns. But on the other hand, when Trump wins in New Hampshire, like he's poised to do apparently in South Carolina, he seems to sweep demographic categories. So I was wondering if you could comment on that, how you resolve that tension.
I suspect we can both comment on that.
I'll just be brief. I mean, no, look, I mean, social scientists and journalists like, he's doing better among working class than middle class. But if you're getting 35% of the vote in a Republican primary, you're getting a lot of middle class and upper middle class votes, and you're getting a lot of college educated as well as high school educated. There aren't that many didn't go to college and are working class incomes in a Republican primary, So Trump is getting, yeah, you're right to say that it's a broader phenomenon than people, I think, often let on. There are a lot of, and he's tapped into a lot of chords that aren't purely economic resentment of stagnating wages either. He's tapped into some genuine sentiments, some false sentiments, some understandable if false sentiments that go up and down the, I think, economic spectrum and the educational spectrum.
Yeah, I would say, just agreeing with the premise of your question before I respond to it, he's tapped into a panoply of resentments, some of which, and I'll use a polite word, are demographic, rooted in the enormous transformation of the U.S. population through legal immigration since we reopened the gates 51 years ago. Some of it, some of it is broadly speaking cultural, and a big piece of it is resentments within the Republican Party left over from the Iraq War. And so I think there are some real tensions within the party that are manifesting themselves, I won't say in isolationist language, but in much more reserved language about the use of American military power on a sustained basis that we've heard from a lot of Republican candidates for a very long time. The piece of the coalition that has surprised me the most, I've been doing a little writing on it, is Trump's appeal to evangelical Christians. Now, this is the oddest couple of all, for reasons that I need not dwell on, but it has produced the biggest analytical surprise for me, namely Ted Cruz, the quintessential evangelical candidate whose entire theory of the case was that he would commandeer that sector of the electorate, use that as a beachhead to build a plurality. Trump beat him among evangelicals in New Hampshire. He performed quite respectably among evangelicals at Iowa, and he has been consistently leading among evangelicals in South Carolina. If he can maintain that lead as the South Carolinians are voting, he will not only win, but win handsomely. If there's a late surge of evangelicals determined not to experience buyer's remorse, then we could have some big surprises.
I just had one sentence, two sentences maybe. I also think David Gollinger has a very good piece in the New Weekly Standard saying if he had to pick one phrase that we shouldn't neglect in explaining Trump's success, it was Trump's brilliant, I don't even know where he got it really, focus on political correctness, which really hit a chord. Mm-hmm. I mean, and this is where I think some of the, especially the liberal media analysis, Trump's a little off, and I'm as critical of Trump as anyone, obviously, but I don't want him to be the nominee, don't want to vote for him and all that, but I would say he's both, he plays on resentments, but he's also kind of weirdly cheerful and good-natured in the way he does so, or you can't quite take him, he doesn't seem like a very bitter human being as an actual person. I think the effects of his policies would be bitter for the country. And I do think that helps him a lot. And I do think the fact that no one else has been willing to call out, or not too many people in politics have been willing to call out political correctness, and he was willing to do it, gives him huge, I'll tell one ridiculous anecdote, which is like almost a caricature of, of an upper middle class person telling an anecdote about someone who's fixing something in his house, but we had some leaks, so some guy came over with his two, helpers to fix this thing. Very nice guy. And he's for Trump. So my wife was saying, well, really? You're for Trump? And he's totally good. He's not bitter. He's not angry. He seems to be doing pretty well. I think he does not have a college education, but he's doing fine. So he's not actually suffering economically. He just likes the fact that Trump is saying it like it, telling it like it is, and sticking it to people. And he's calling out this insane political correctness. And, and so there's a weird way in which Trump is a particularly effective demagogue, because he doesn't seem to be a bitter and angry demagogue often. He seems to be a bizarrely cheerful demagogue, even as he says totally outrageous things.
Sounds pretty angry to me, but I guess we'll have to adjudicate this one.
One more for each. Okay, over here, sir.
Hi there, Pierce from UVA. Could you gentlemen riff on the esteem with which voters, particularly in the Republican primary, hold executive experience? There are three two-term Republican governors who can't seem to gain any traction. What do you make of that?
It was always a myth. I mean, this was like Republicans tell each other, especially if I can say in rooms like this, that, we love people who have business experience or governing experience. Experience is so hard. The problem with Obama is they didn't have experience. Hey, it's not clear that the problem with Obama was that he didn't have experience. The problem, from a conservative point of view, is that he was quite liberal in his policies. He's been pretty effective at, I'd say, implementing a lot of them and pushing them through. So it's not clear to me that he needed that much more experience or what difference it would have made, really. But I think it's always, Republicans say they like that, but when it comes to voting, this wasn't amazing, but you're right, you're absolutely right to point to it. If you had said we would end up, given the history of Republican selections, that we would end up with someone the top three are probably going to be someone who's never held elective office and two people who are first-term senators. That is not your typical multi-term governor, multi-term senator like John McCain, World War II commander like Dwight D. Eisenhower, sitting or former vice president like a Nixon or George H.W. Bush. So it is, but that's what happens in a populist moment, because this was evident with Jeb Bush. I have a lot of experience, but your experience is being part of the political class we dislike. It's like saying, hey, I've been CEO of 4 companies. They've all kind of gone down the tubes, but it's really, I've been CEO. I think it's hard to blame the voters in that respect. But look, Rick, it is amazing. Rick Perry is in fact the one who I would say is the most, probably just empirically, the state that's done the best over the last 15 years. And if you're a Republican, a ton of policies, and a conservative that you would like, absolutely nowhere. Absolutely nowhere.
All right, one last question over here.
Summer Bailey, Tuck alum. There seems to be a lot of confusion both in the media and in a big chunk of the minds of the voting public around free market capitalism versus crony capitalism. What, in your view, can be done to separate the two and revive the image of true free market capitalism in the hearts and minds of the voting public?
You want to take that?
Well, I know that comparison is popular in many circles, and I'm no more a fan of crony capitalism than anybody in this room. And I would be very happy to see a tax code that ceased and desisted from subsidizing any or all specific industries or specific companies. And I've been in Washington now for almost 35 years, and I've seen how tax policy gets made, and a model of democratic deliberation it is not. But having said that, I don't think the principal problem with the economy right now, analytically, is the influence of special interest businesses on it. As I said before, I think we have a bigger problem. And the bigger problem are the macro changes that, frankly, neither political party has figured out how to handle in a way that spreads the benefits of a free market system to the vast majority of the population. The withdrawal of trust and confidence in the free market from the free market system has nothing to do with the Ex-Im Bank and other things, that Washington conservatives are fond of talking about. It has to do with the fact that, corrected for inflation, wages and benefits in substantial portions of the population have not risen in the past 40 years. It has a lot to do with the fact that in 2015, The share of profits in the total GDP was at a record high, and the share of wages of the GDP was at a low. The market system will be popular when the people leading it figure out how everybody can participate in the benefits of upward mobility. And as long as that condition is not satisfied, as it was in the first 25 years after the Second World War, markets are not going to be popular, either here or in Europe.
And I would just say, well, from a more narrow political point of view, I mean, we had a Republican president for 8 years, and a Republican House for 5 now, and a Republican Senate for 1, and they haven't done much. I haven't really tried, honestly, or they haven't tried too visibly, let's say, to do much about, quote, crony capitalism. There's some disconnect. The voters, you can't blame the voter for having a disconnect when, on the one hand, these politicians are screaming about crony capitalism. Well, there was a Republican budget that passed one house of Congress for 4 years and then passed both houses the last year. Did it really dismantle all this crony? I mean, the Ex-Im Bank was the one thing that they actually managed to sort of get a force a vote on, but then, of course, it turns out they couldn't hold a lot of Republicans on that in the Senate. So I do think leaving aside Bill's much broader points about the economy as a whole, from a sort of practical political point of view, I think voters have a very high discount now when they hear a conservative politician who's been in office, especially in Washington, show up and say, I'm the guy who's going to take on crony capitalism. Is there any, can we have one program that you got rid of or that you forced President Obama to veto 2 or 3 times? In 95, 96, Republican Gingrich led an earlier version, you might say, of Republican Revolution. Welfare reform was a key part of it. We can argue and discuss the details. They passed 3 welfare reform, pretty big and bold welfare reform, 3 times. President Clinton signed it the 3rd time. At least there was then, you could say, you know what, that was a pretty impressive change. There's been nothing like that, I think it's fair to say, from this Republican Congress. And you know, it's hard when with the Senate, Democrats controlling the Senate through 2014, and then with President Obama blocking things. But you can understand why voters are a little skeptical.
Alas, that is going to do it for us. Let's have a big round of applause for Bill Galston, Bill Kristol.